My name is Christina Bologna. I am the Administrative Assistant with Coastal Community Capital, which is...
As Christina said, my name is Mike Baker, and I'm with S.C.O.R.E. Any of you ever had any contact with S.C.O.R.E? You know what it is?
I know what it is, yes.
Well, I'm going to hand you one of these anyway. Oh, and this as well. Did you say you had some contact?
Yes.
Were you a S.C.O.R.E client or?
I did go and meet with them at one point. Yes, I did. Thank you.
Just briefly, so if you haven't had contact, you understand what S.C.O.R.E does. We're basically an affiliate of the Small Business Administration. And we offer counseling to people who either want to start a business or if they're in business, need some assistance, either to grow the business or lately to survive what we're going through right now. It's a national organization. At the local level, we've got about 38 counselors. We've got people who are trained in almost any aspect of business that you can think of. There are marketing people, there are sales people. I'm a financial guy, e-commerce, how to prepare a business plan. I doubt that there's a problem you could have that we couldn't find an expert to match you up with if you wanted some counseling. Briefly, we counsel Monday through Friday from 9 to 1. If you're interested in making an appointment, if you flip that brochure over on the back, there's some contact information, telephone number. What I'd suggest you do, if you think you might be interested in using S.C.O.R.E services, is go on our website, not the national website, but our local website, and just surf that for a little bit, and you'll get a much better feel for the kinds of things we do and whether or not you think it might make sense for you to utilize our services. The other brochure I gave you, if you think you might be interested in this, is we run a 7-week small business management course at 4Cs in Upper Cape. The next session at 4C starts next week on the 20th. The session at the Upper Cape Regional Technical School starts, I think, 2 weeks later. I think the first week in February. And the brochure gives you a pretty good description of what the course involves. Basically, 7 S.C.O.R.E counselors, each one of them expert in the field that he teaches, runs a 2-hour session on Tuesday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. Might be a session on business planning, might be a session on marketing, might be one on sales. In my case, it's on some of the same material we're going to talk about this afternoon. I've got a quick handout for you here. We're going to use this as we go through the class. So let me pass that out to you.
I'm sure she'd be happy to hand that to me. I'm sure she'd be happy to do that.
You know what else might be easier, since there's so few of us? If you guys just move down this way, I'm going to do some work on the board here. I think it might be easier for you to see if you're down here. And while you're moving,
I don't like being that close to people. That's why I'm way back here. I'm only kidding.
overseas, the class is held in Lecture Hall A. Familiar with the campus, it's the biggest lecture hall on the campus. Seats about 110 people. It's about 40 rows, 30 rows, whatever. And even when we only have 35 to 40 people in the class, somebody always sits up in that row. There's something about students wanting to get as far away from the teacher as they can. I think it starts when you're in elementary school. Just quickly, a little bit about my background. I spent about a dozen years in corporate finance and wound up as the chief financial officer for a company that made computer peripheral equipment. And left that to come to the Cape around 1973 to get involved in real estate development. And for about 13 years I ran my own real estate development company. I bought land, subdivided it, put in the roads and utilities, built single-family homes, had a brokerage, basically 3 separate corporations. And probably during that period built something close to 1,000 houses. So it was a decent-sized operation. and left that. I retired in 1986, thank God. Here's some wood I can rub. Right about at the peak of the boom, people said to me at the time, "How did you know?" And I said, "You know, I didn't. I just didn't want to do this anymore. I had something else I wanted to do instead." Never underestimate the importance of good luck. You know, I don't care how smart you think you are and how hard you work. If you're not lucky, it doesn't always work for you. Spent the next 13 years as a professor of business administration at Bristol Community College in Fall River, and taught courses in finance, accounting, management, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. Retired from that 10 years ago, and for the last 10 years I've been involved in a number of volunteer activities, among which is S.C.O.R.E, which is why I'm here. So one of the things I suppose you could say is I'm talking to you as someone who has difficulty holding a job, because it seems like every 12 years or so I rotate out of something.
What is your name, sir?
Mike Baker.
Okay.
We're going to talk about three things, actually, in the course of the next hour and a half. One of them is how to collect and use financial information to run your business better. I'm not going to teach you how to keep a set of books. I'm just going to talk about what statements you ought to produce, however you choose to produce them, how to read and use them in order to make your business more successful. Secondly, we're going to talk about pricing policy. And thirdly, we're going to spend some time talking about cash flow management. Those are the three general topics that we're going to cover. So the title of this is a little misleading and too broad, frankly. A lot more specific than that. Now, just by way of a little background, I know none of you went into business to be bookkeepers.
Actually, I have an accounting degree, but I've gotten away from it.
Well, that's what happens.
Oh, I didn't intend to be a bookkeeper.
Then you might be able to relate to this, and I know because I went through it myself. You come home at the end of the day, you're tired, you want to sit down and take a shower, have a meal. In my case, I'm a little partial to single malt Scotch whiskey. I like to work that in someplace in the course of the evening. And you've got some paperwork to do. Maybe 40, 45 minutes worth of stuff. Invoices to send out, bills to pay, records to post. I see you're nodding your head because you know what's coming next. You say, yeah, you know what, I'll do it tomorrow. The next day, and you're smiling.
I'm awful.
The next day you come home, you want the drink and the shower and the meal just as badly as you did the day before, only now you have an hour and a half's worth of paperwork to do. You say, yeah, I'll do it on the weekend. The weekend rolls around and there's all sorts of family activities. Soccer games, whatever. And so you go along like that for weeks at a time until finally some event requires that you get all of this stuff together and dump it on your accountant. Usually it's because a tax return has to be prepared. The accountant prepares the tax return, he hands it to you, maybe you read it, maybe you don't. You sign it, you mail it in, and that's it for you. Now, think about this. If you had done something that was a result of poor management in January of 2008, and this is the system you used, you did it wrong for 15 months before you produced the statement that pointed that out to you. Something you could have fixed in February of 2008, you now, if you pay attention to your tax return, can't fix until about April of 2009. And yet that's what happens with most people. That's the system they work with. Let me give you an illustration, a practical illustration of the difference that paying attention to this stuff can make to you. I had a client come in a while ago. He was a building contractor. He'd been in business for a while. And he said this to me. He said, you know, I don't know whether you can help me or you can't. I'm busy, but I don't feel successful. My revenues are up, but my profits are not. From time to time, I run out of cash in my business, and I have to dip into my personal stash and keep the company going. I can usually pay myself back, but I don't understand why that happens. And I said to him, what do you produce for financial statements? Oh, I'm on QuickBooks. I produce a statement every month. I've got the most recent one here. And he showed it to me, and I looked at it for, I think, all of about 30 seconds, and I said, these are useless. And he laughed, and he said, that's what my accountant says. He was mixing up personal and business transactions. He was not posting in a timely fashion. He was not posting to the correct accounts. And what he was producing every month was basically so much scrap paper. And the only time he really got a legitimate statement, again, was when his accountant produced his tax return. I'll skip all of the detail stuff and simply tell you that it took a while to get his accounting straightened out. We did. And the last time I saw his financial information, which was about a year ago, he had doubled his revenues. He had increased his gross margin by over 5% from what it was previously. And he had put in his pocket in that fiscal year over $200,000 in personal income. Now, we didn't make the business decisions for him that made that possible. He made those. He was a sharp businessman once he had accurate information to base his business decisions on. But that's the difference that learning how to read and use financial statements made to him. Wouldn't be that dramatic in every single case, but it can't help but make your business more efficient if you learn how to do this stuff. If that's the only thing you walk out remembering, I'll be happy. Okay. Now, let me be more precise. A typical package of financial statements. How many of you produce financial information on a regular basis, by the way? Do you? What do you get?
I mean, well, I have a bookkeeper once a week, so
Okay.
that is what, this is exactly what we're doing.
Oh, okay. Okay. And do you produce monthly statements?
No, okay.
Okay, so occasional statements.
None.
Nothing. Okay. 3 potential converts. The first and most commonly looked at of these is the income statement, and I've given you a very reduced example. I call it a profit and loss statement on this first page of the material I handed out. It's on the very first page. In its simplest form, and I'm going to repeat what's on your sheet because I want to play with the numbers a little bit. In its simplest form, it looks something like this. You've got sales of 800,000. K is my abbreviation for thousands. You've got cost of goods sold. In my example of 560,000. And cost of goods sold, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is basically cost of the product that you buy or make, stick on the shelf and resell. If you're a home builder, then cost of goods sold is the cost of the material and labor that goes into building a house. You're a home repair business.
Yes.
Your cost of goods sold would be the same thing. The direct material cost and the direct labor cost of the addition that you built or the deck you built, or I don't know exactly what the scope of your business is, but stuff like that. You're in same thing, so it would be the same thing. You're in the landscaping business.
So I'm more service.
Yeah,
I don't have
you're
a product.
really more
I
of
have
a service
limited,
business.
I have very limited product.
Yeah, you might have, unless you're into building stone walls and things.
Well, sometimes I resell plants.
And the difference between these two is what's called gross margin or gross profit. And in the case of my example, it's 240,000, and it's 30% of sales. That can be a very important number in particularly the remodeling business, where I understand you like to shoot for about 35% if you can get it. I don't know if you can get it in this environment, but that's an objective. Then you subtract operating expense, And operating expenses, basically everything else that you spend to run the company. It's heat, light, and power, it's your office rent, it's your vehicles, it's insurance premiums, it's office staff, if you have office staff. As I said, literally everything that it costs to run the company that's not included in that number. And in my example, I've said that comes to $160,000. I've stipulated an owner draw of $60,000. An owner draw would be the equivalent of the owner's salary. In an unincorporated business, it's a draw. In an incorporated business, you pay yourself a salary. So the person who runs this organization is taking about $1,200 a week in round numbers. Whoops. I left out a number here. I got to subtract that to get to net income of $80,000. And then you can see on your example, the owner takes 60 and there's 20 left over for profit. My question for you is, as outside observers, how do you do? Is that a good performance?
I think so.
Because 80,000 is an attractive profit for you for a business that size?
Well, the 80,000, I don't know.
I mean, it's better to make money than not to make money.
Yeah, yes,
and so
yes.
he made money, but is that a good result? Is it a result that would satisfy you?
Not to mine, no.
Okay. What do you think?
Well, I don't think, I can't put a relationship to the cost of goods with sale to argue that point, because it is what it is. So, you can't argue that unless you want to increase your sales by pumping up the price somehow. That can't be argued. I don't know how 10% relates to sales. 80 is 10% of 800. But I wouldn't relate it to that. I'd relate it back to the gross margin.
I don't know, it seems good to me.
Looks good to you. Let me change the question a little bit. Suppose I told you that this company had been in business for a while, and that last year sales had been $700,000 and the company had broken even, and the year before sales had been $600,000 and the company had lost money.
It would
So,
be good.
How would that year look?
That would
Good.
be good.
I mean, that's a nice trend. 600, 700, 800, from losing money to making 80 grand. Suppose I flipped that around and told you that a couple of years ago this company had sales of $1 million and generated $200,000 in income. Last year, $900,000 and $150,000 in income. This year, $800,000 and $80,000 in income.
You'd be 10 retired.
Suppose I told you that the budget for this year had called for $900,000 in sales and $120,000 in profit. Not a good performance compared to budget. Suppose I told you the budget called for $750,000 in sales and $50,000 in profit. That's a good result. What's my point?
Numbers matter.
My point is that this statement, all by itself, in a vacuum, is useless for learning how to run your company better. It just tells you what happened. As you said, what is. That's all this tells you. This is what happened. It doesn't tell you where you might have done things less well than you hoped to and how you might be able to fix them. You only get that with comparisons. So if you're going to generate this information, if it's going to be useful as a management device, as a management tool, you've got to compare it to something. And the most common comparisons are either to last year. Did I do better or worse than last year? If so, why? Where are the differences? What's responsible for them? Is it something I can do something about? And if it is, how can I fix it? Or compare it to your budget. You ought to do a budget every year, and then you ought to set your budget up in another column right next to this and produce what are called variances or differences. Identify where things were different and see if you can figure out where. Specifically, what went wrong that you could do something about, that you could fix. You can also compare to industry averages, but I'm not crazy about that, particularly with small businesses. You asked, for example, if 10% was a good return on sales. Well, in the supermarket business, it's a spectacular return on sales. In the pharmaceuticals business, it's a lousy return on sales. So the answer is it depends on what industry you're in. I don't think those comparisons are particularly meaningful, but the other comparisons, the budget to last year, those are meaningful comparisons. One other thing you want to make sure you do, and by the way, interrupt me at any point if you have a question, okay? All right.
Do you have four-wheel drive? Because you might be getting worried looking at the snow.
No.
Are you worried?
No, I'm not. The other thing you want to do is generate enough detailed information so that when you identify an issue, you can pinpoint what went wrong. Let me give you a specific example that comes back to the contractor that I mentioned earlier. His gross margin was running right around 30%, and his objective was 35%. When he quoted jobs, when he did estimates, he would shoot for a 35% gross margin on the estimates. And he thought, well, 30% wasn't what he was anticipating. It was reasonably close. He didn't identify that as a major problem. And I said to him, before you go ahead and start raising your prices to get to that 35%, do you ever keep track of gross margin by individual job? He said, no, I could. I mean, I've got the information broken down by job, so if I wanted to run that, I could, but I never have. I said, do me a favor, run your last dozen jobs, and let's take a look at what the gross margin by job looked like. And what we discovered was he was all over the place. He had some jobs where he had a 10% margin. He had some jobs where he had a 60% margin. He was a lousy estimator. It wasn't that he was not charging enough. He was estimating incorrectly. And what happens when you estimate incorrectly in your business is, first of all, you get all of the jobs that you estimated too low because you beat everybody else who estimated correctly. And you lose a lot of jobs where you estimated too high because your bid is too high. And you could have taken those jobs if you estimated them correctly. You could have taken those jobs and made good money on them, but you lost them instead. And one of the first things he did was to go out and hire an estimator. And all of a sudden his gross margin was up 35, 36, 37%, and consistent job to job. But he wouldn't have known that if he hadn't broken down all of those individual jobs and discovered this pattern that indicated that he was having difficulty with his estimating. That's what I mean by saying make sure you get enough detail. So two things to remember if you're going to produce income statements and then use them to run your business better. One, compare this information to something, a budget or or last year. And secondly, on the accounts that are important, make sure you get enough detail so you can identify specifically what went wrong when something went wrong. Okay? Any questions on that one? The least useful, to me, statement for management purposes is the balance sheet. But it does allow you to track one issue which can be critically important to your business, and so I'm going to talk about that for a minute. Basically what a balance sheet does is it takes the whole business and breaks it down into two categories. What you own, and those are your assets. It's your building, it's your equipment, it's your car, it's the cash in the checking account, it's accounts receivable, if you have accounts receivable, it's your inventory, anything that's of value that you own. And over here, how you paid for it. And in business, there are only two ways you can pay for something, just as there are in your personal life. You either borrow the money or you put it in yourself or with partners. If you put it in yourself or with partners, it's called equity capital. And if you borrow it, it's debt capital. And those two things equal or balance, and that's why it's called a balance sheet. Everything you own was paid for that way. And if you think about your personal assets, the exact same thing is true in your personal life. What you want to pay attention to when you look at these statements is this, and I'm going to introduce a couple of terms that you may not be familiar with first, and then we'll talk about the importance of them. First is solvency. Do you know what it means to be solvent? You probably heard the term, but
You go out to dinner every Friday.
not necessarily. As a matter of fact, not necessarily. Anybody else? Do you know what it means to be solvent? To be solvent means the value of what you own exceeds what you owe. If you have a house that's worth $500,000 and it's the only thing that you own, and it has a mortgage of $300,000 and that's the only thing you owe, you're solvent. Okay? The value of what you own exceeds the value of what you owe. Most companies, not so sure that's true in this current crisis, but over time, most companies that fail are solvent. Most companies that fail are solvent. Liquidity means what?
Ability to
Hey,
grab
Your
cash.
ability to meet your obligations in a timely fashion. Basically, you have cash and can pay your bills. And if you own a house that's worth $500,000, and if you have a $300,000 mortgage, and you're solvent, and you've lost your job and you can't pay your mortgage, meaning you're illiquid, then you're in trouble. And that's what gets businesses in trouble. They carry more debt than they really ought to carry. Not enough so that they're insolvent, but more debt than they can afford to carry, except under the best of circumstances. And the first time they hit a bump in the road, they can't handle it. Most businesses that fail, small businesses, don't fail because the owners are not smart. Usually they are. And they don't fail because the owners don't work hard enough. Most of the time they do. They fail because they're undercapitalized. They have too little equity in the business and too much debt. And they cannot, the first time a large accounts receivable doesn't come through on time, the first time one of your customers doesn't pay a big bill, but you've got wages to pay and suppliers to take care of, you're not in a position to withstand that, and down you go. And that's what's happening a lot now. Which means you need to keep your eye on that relationship. If your business gets to the point where it's financed much too heavily with debt and has too little capital, increasingly you're putting yourself in a position where you're vulnerable to a downturn. What we see happening right now with S.C.O.R.E clients, and they're coming in by the boatloads, unfortunately, is this. People started out with an acceptable debt-equity ratio, might have bumped up the debt, maybe the business grew a little bit. At some point, the banks said no to lending the business any more money, and the owners either floated a home equity loan and put that money in the business, or they ran up credit card debt and put that money in the business, or did both. In many cases, did both. And while the money went into the business in the form of equity because it was the owner putting the money in, the fact is that the only way the owner could pay the personal debt back was by income generated by the business. So whether you called it debt or you called it equity, it was effectively all debt. And then all of a sudden we hit this recession, business turned down, the credit card debt couldn't be paid back, the home equity loan couldn't be increased, and people just ran out of gas. The single significant value to the balance sheet, in my opinion, is this. That is, keeping your eye on your true debt-equity ratio, taking into account whatever money you may have borrowed personally and put into your business. And if you get into the point where you just keep borrowing and borrowing and putting it in and putting it in, you need to stop. Sometimes you need to stop and say, I've got to fundamentally change direction and salvage what I can. And we're seeing an awful lot of people in that situation. I can't tell you how many people in the last 6 months I've had to say, we can't help you. This isn't a solvable problem. You need to talk to a credit counselor, you need to talk to an attorney, but there's no business solution to this. That's what you want to pay attention to. Any question on that? Yeah, you depressed yet? The third statement in this package of three is the cash flow statement. And I'll preface my discussion by saying that if somebody were to say to me in running my business, you could have any one of these statements, but only one. You could have an income statement, you could have a balance sheet, or you could have a cash flow statement. I would choose the cash flow statement every time. When I say that to people, they'll often say, why isn't the income statement the most important one? After all, that's the one that tells you whether you've made money or you haven't made money. The cash flow statement doesn't tell you that. It just tells you what's in the checkbook. The implication of that question is that you can be profitable and run out of cash. And the answer to that is, yeah, it happens a lot. Let me tell you how. If you look on this handout that I've provided you with, again, on the first page, next to the profit and loss statement, I've given you, for the same company and during the same period of time, a cash flow statement. There are three things on the cash flow statement that affect cash that don't affect the profit and loss statement. One of them is accounts receivable in the amount of $40,000. That's my little abbreviation for accounts receivable. What that means is that you billed out $800,000 worth of sales, but you only collected $760,000 because so far somebody hasn't paid you. Until you write that off as a bad debt, that won't appear on your profit and loss statement. So this is something that doesn't affect the profit and loss statement, but reduces your cash balance by 40 grand because you didn't collect it. You went out and bought a new truck. The year looked like it was going to be a good year. Your truck was getting old. You figured you could afford to do this, and so you went out and you spent $30,000 on a truck. That truck doesn't affect the profit and loss statement. If you bought it, it will next year because something called depreciation expense will turn up on your income statement. But in this current year, it hasn't turned up at all. But the cash is gone. And because business is a little bit better, you added $10,000 to inventory. So you went out and bought some stock, maybe some lumber, if you run a little warehouse and you keep some of that in a warehouse. Do you keep a storage shed of some kind? And keep some inventory in it? Okay. Do you? You did though.
I did.
So you spent $10,000 on inventory. The inventory won't affect the balance sheet, the income statement, until you sell it. In the meantime, it sits there on your balance sheet, but doesn't appear on the profit and loss statement. So at the same time that your income statement shows that you made $80,000, of which you then took $60,000, leaving a $20,000 surplus, you ate up an additional $80,000 in cash. And you're now $60,000 in the hole. You have $60,000 less cash than you did a year ago, in a year that looks very successful. And what typically happens is, this doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single $40,000 receivable, for example. It might be another 5, and then 10, and then 3, and then 7, as you go through the year. The inventory purchases don't happen all at once. The truck purchase does. And so, this isn't a sudden event. It's something that takes place over maybe several months, and then one day you wake up and all of a sudden there's no cash in the checkbook, and you don't know why. The fellow who said to me, I run out of cash from time to time and have to dip into my pocket to keep the company going, and I don't understand why, was talking about exactly this kind of situation, because this is exactly the sort of thing he was doing. When I ran my home real estate business, land development and home building gobbles cash. Absolutely gobbles cash. You live on debt. And I did an income statement maybe once a quarter. I pretty much knew where I was. I wasn't worried about it. I did a balance sheet once a year simply because it popped out with all of the other statements. And I did cash flows constantly. And I mean constantly, because that was absolutely critical. If I didn't make a mortgage payment, if I couldn't pay the crews, if I couldn't pay a supplier, I was done. And so I focused on that and nothing else. And for most small businesses, I would say that is the single most important statement. Interestingly enough, this turns out to be a major problem for growing businesses, because what typically happens when your business starts growing is your receivables go up. You've got more customers, so you're letting people charge more. Your inventory goes up because you need more stock on the shelves if you were doing a retail business. Your fixed assets go up because you need more space and usually more equipment. And the rate at which those things go up and use up cash exceeds the rate at which your profit goes up in the short term. Now, eventually, years and years of additional profitability make it worthwhile for you to make that investment. But in the first year, all of those things will cost you more cash than you can bring in. Does that mean you shouldn't grow? Of course not. That's what banks are for. If you anticipate these needs, and we're going to talk about cash flow projections at the tail end of this, if you anticipate those needs and do a cash flow projection and take it down to the bank, you can borrow the money to fuel your growth. But you need to plan for it. You can't just let it happen to you. When banks, we often tell S.C.O.R.E clients, when banks lend money, they buy two things. They buy into two things. They buy into your plan and whether or not it makes sense, and they buy into your ability to make that plan happen. And one of the things they look for in making a judgment as to whether or not you're someone they want to have a relationship with is whether or not you do that kind of planning. Have you anticipated a need? Have you been able to quantify it and then come in with an application and talk about how much you need, when you need it, what you need it for, and when you can pay it back? Any questions on that? Am I that clear? Is any of this helpful to you guys? Is this
Very interesting, yes.
Okay. So I should keep going?
Yes.
Next thing I want to talk about is pricing policy. Not pricing per se. I'm not talking about how you quote a job here. And this is going to get to be a little bit more complicated a conversation than you might have thought it was going to be. How you price, how you choose a pricing policy which will dictate what you wind up charging, which is probably a better way for me to put it, is going to be influenced by your cost structure. It's going to be influenced by the amount of volume that you do or want to do, and it's going to be influenced by the competitive position that you put yourself in the marketplace. Let me give you, I think, a good illustration. A couple of years ago, when my third grandchild arrived, we decided, my wife and I, that we needed to redo the basement because we couldn't handle those three little ones upstairs anymore. And so I went out. I had an unfinished basement that was a perfect area for a playroom. And it was about as straightforward a job as you'll appreciate this, about as straightforward a job as you can do. It was 800 square feet, a box, studs, insulation, plaster, hung ceiling, carpeting on the floor, a few doors, heat, wiring, pure vanilla job. And I had 3 people come in and quote it, all of whom I knew something about. And the quotes were $40,000, $30,000, and $20,000.
The guy for 40 had plenty of work.
No. And somebody said to me when I told them the story, well, how can that be? They all do the same thing. And I said, no, they don't. They're in fact not really in the same business, except that they all finish off basements. The fellow who quoted 40 delivers and promises and delivers exceptional quality and service. His primary customer is a second homeowner with a lot of money who needs a fairly good sized remodeling job and wants it done while he's not here. So he wants somebody he knows he can trust, and he wants it done on time. And to do that, you need a pretty good sized staff. You need employees, not subcontractors. You need a fair number of them. You need to be able to control them so that you can promise a delivery date and deliver on time. And there are enough people willing to pay for that he can be successful running that kind of business. The other extreme at 20,000, who was a guy who I've known for years and years and years and have a lot of regard for, runs his own shop. He's the only employee. Works out of his house. His truck is his office. He's been in business for a long time and has a terrific reputation. But I know enough about the business to know that somebody like that isn't going to have subcontractors at his beck and call. And there are going to be times when he's going to have to wait for somebody to show up. There are going to be times when you need service and he can't get there right away. If he personally became ill or had to miss work for an extended period of time, the delivery date would have to be extended. He's not going to get the best prices, the same prices as someone else might on certain kinds of work. And I accept that. If I choose to do business with someone like that, I accept that that's what's coming in the bargain. He's very successful at what he does. And the guy in the middle was actually somewhere between those two extremes. All 3 of them have different pricing policies, partly because they position themselves differently in the marketplace. Okay? And that's what dictates their pricing policy. Now, I want to talk a little about what's called break-even analysis to illustrate what I just covered in a little bit more detail. If you flip to the second page, you'll see a little discussion of what's involved with break-even analysis. You can take all the costs that your business incurs and divide them into 2 categories: fixed costs and variable cost. Fixed costs are literally just what they sound like. They are fixed, irrespective of volume. I get the simplest example I can ever think of is if you're running a limousine service and you own a limousine, then once you park it in the driveway, you've got a fixed cost. Whether you drive 10,000 miles or a mile, that's a fixed cost. You have to pay for it every single month. If you're in business and you have an office building, your mortgage is a fixed cost. If you have equipment and you're leasing it, your leased equipment is a fixed cost. Your insurance premium that you pay usually annually is a fixed cost for that year. All of those things are fixed irrespective of volume. Variable costs go up and down with activity. If you're a home builder and you don't build any houses, you have no cost of materials and no cost of direct labor. The more houses you build, the more material cost you have, the more direct labor costs you have. Those go up and down with volume. Everybody okay with that? Understand the concept? Now you'll notice I've got a couple of formulas I want to walk you through that allow you to calculate the point at which your business breaks even. Okay? The first says sales minus variable cost equals gross margin. And if you go back to the first page of my handout and you look at the profit and loss example I gave you, you've got a perfect example of this. Your sales were $800,000. Your variable costs were $560,000. Your gross margin was $240,000. Right? The next formula says if you take gross margin and you divide that by sales, then you get a gross margin percentage. In this case, 240,000 divided by 800,000 gives you the gross margin percentage we talked about earlier of 30%.
Hi. I'm not sure I'm in the right place. They have the website.
It is. We are about halfway through.
I know. I've been looking for you for about an hour.
Oh. It's pretty dreadful out there.
Well, I came off tape. And,
Oh, you're
the
kidding.
directions were just to go to 5 shoot fly, where they.
Well, why don't you sit down?
I'll see if I can catch it.
And that's the handout we're working on. And we're in
Do
the
you
mid-
think it's really too late to be here?
No, there are 3 discrete topics we're talking about. We've covered one, but we're just in the beginning of the second one. So
Thank you.
you can still catch up on about 2/3 of the discussion.
Okay.
And you can get the first part on the internet later.
He's filming this.
Oh,
So.
perfect.
They gotta come on and
And then finally, if you take your fixed cost and you divide them
so you can
by
see.
your gross margin percentage, you'll arrive at your break-even point, which is the third of the 3 formulas. Fixed cost was $160,000. I'm going to call the operating expenses that are on that statement fixed cost. I'm going to assume they're all fixed costs. Most of them probably are. I'm going to divide that by the gross margin percentage of 0.3, and I'm going to get a break-even point of $533,000. And basically, what that says is, if I can generate revenue of $533,000 and achieve a 30% gross margin, I will cover my fixed cost and I'll break even. Nothing in there for my income. Notice that 160 doesn't include the money I want to earn for myself. If I care about that, and obviously I do, let's change this and consider my salary, my $80,000 salary plus profit, okay, as a fixed cost. My feeling being, if I can't earn that, then I don't want to do this anyway. And if you do that, 240,000 divided by a 30% gross margin will give you $800,000. Or to look at it another way, if I can do $800,000 worth of business at a 30% gross margin, I can cover my fixed costs and put 80 grand in my pocket. That's what that says. And what you've done is you've built a little financial model of a business that incorporates costs and volume into a pricing target. The pricing target in this case is 30% gross margin. I can now say, okay, if I'm happy with that, if I think I can do 800 grand worth of business, then I'm going to go out and do my estimates based on a 30% gross margin. And if I can hold my costs in line with what I projected and I can do that volume of business, I'll make the money I'm looking to make. Okay? You can play now with those variables in this formula to see what would happen if your gross margin percentage was higher. What would happen if your gross margin percentage had to be lower? Let's say in this competitive environment, for example, that you're out there bidding on jobs with a 20% gross margin because of the competition you're experiencing. Everybody's out there trying to hustle up work. Okay? What would the consequence be to me in my business if all of a sudden that became 20%? Well, one of 2 things is going to have to happen. At 20%, I'm going to have to do a lot more business, or I'm going to have to cut my fixed costs. How much do I have to cut them? We could work that out using this information. But instead of doing that specific example, let me demonstrate one.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Doesn't fixed imply that there's not a lot of room to move with that?
Fixed implies it's fixed over a certain period of time. All costs are variable ultimately. Okay? And so you're right, you can't cut your fixed cost instantly.
But it might mean moving out of an office that you're renting and working in your home, you're saying?
Eventually.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. One of the people I counseled had a lot of debt service because he picked up properties at different times, better times. And this goes back a few years. And the debt service, which was a fixed cost, was becoming a problem for him. And so what we worked on, it took 6 months to a year to accomplish, was selling off some of those properties. So it was fixed at the time. He then had to address how to get rid of that fixed cost. And you're right, you can't do that instantly. Hopefully what you do is you do this sort of stuff far enough in advance so that you're not in a crisis situation and you have time to react.
Okay.
But the point I want to make is even more fundamental than that, because better than reacting to a crisis is building a cost structure that you can live with in the first place so that you don't find yourself in this situation. And we'll get to that in a minute. If you flip to the third page, I've done a little chart here which basically says, using the assumption of $160,000 in fixed cost, and assuming the owner wants to generate $80,000 in profit for himself, what combinations will do that for him? Well, if you shoot for a gross margin of 40%, you'll notice that sales of $600,000 gets the job done. If you look in the $600,000 revenue or sales line and you look under 40%, follow it across, you'll see that you cover your fixed cost and you stick 80 grand in your profit, in your pocket. Yes? Everybody okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
But you can also do it with a 30% gross margin and sales of $800,000. Follow that across?
Mm-hmm.
And you can also do it, although the number doesn't leap off the page, you can also do it with sales of $1 million and a gross profit margin of 25%. One of the things that we hear often from S.C.O.R.E clients when I'll suggest, for example, that they need to raise their gross margin is, but I'll lose business. And I'll say, so what? So what? If you were at 25% gross margin and doing $1 million worth of sales, you could afford to lose 40% of your business if you raised your profit up to 40% and not be any worse off, and run a lot smaller operation, which is a lot more nimble in terms of adapting to changing economic circumstances. There's nothing wrong with being aggressive with your pricing and losing business, so long as you wind up in the place where you want to wind up. But most small business people don't think about that issue when they price. Most people price, when you're a small business person, most of the time you price against the competition. If everybody else is pricing 30% gross margin, you do 30% gross margin. If they go to 35, you go to 35. The other thing I would add, although it's probably not true now, but under more stable circumstances, is you'd be astonished how often people raise prices and don't lose any business at all. The fact is that in relatively normal times, within reason, price isn't the paramount consideration for lots of people. Word of mouth, knowing you're doing business with somebody who's reliable, those things become more important than price. And so long as you stay within reason, you can be a little aggressive with your pricing and not lose any business at all. One of the things that, again, except in times like this, one of the things that I've encouraged people to do as they go through the year is, all right, I understand you're reluctant to raise your prices in the beginning of the year. You want to make sure you've got a good year, a decent year. So quote it 30%. And then when you're far enough into the year that you feel comfortable that you've got the year covered, that you're going to have a decent year, try 35% on some of your jobs. If you get them, you get them. If you don't, you don't. See what happens. And they'll come back almost always and say, guess what? I kicked it up to 35%, got to work anyway. And you can ease into it. It's almost like convincing yourself that this is okay to do. You can ease into it that way. Okay? My point here is just when you put your business together, well, let me back up a minute. Okay? Come back to the issue of high fixed costs. In the construction industry, when I was in it, you had a contrast between those people, particularly in prosperous times, who would own their own office building, have a number of vehicles, all of them new, including their personal vehicles, gobble up a bunch of land and mortgage it and have that as a debt service requirement, which is a fixed cost. Add some employees, own their own equipment rather than lease. All of that adds to fixed cost. A lot of it has to be financed with debt. And so you've got this combination of very high fixed costs, which require a lot of volume to service, and high debt service because of the high loans, the amount of debt they incurred to acquire these assets. Did those people make more money in good times? Yes, they did. For reasons that probably go beyond the scope of what we're discussing here. Mostly because their variable costs tend to be lower. Businesses that are structured that way tend to be more profitable at high volume levels. At the other extreme, you have the contractor who rents his office space, uses mostly subs, as few employees as possible. They supply the equipment, buy a lot as you need it, as you go along, but not a heavy investment in land inventory, for example. Very little debt service. Are those people less successful in good times? Yes. Their variable costs are higher, their volume is lower, they won't be as profitable. But when times turn bad, and you're stuck with high fixed costs and high levels of debt, and all of a sudden your revenue disappears, those people disappear. And I can tell you in the late 80s and early 90s, an awfully high percentage of them did. A lot of guys that I knew when I was in the business in 86 were gone in 90 and 91. The people who had more modest aspirations survived and lived to prosper another day. It's a risk-reward decision that you get to make as a business owner. You get to choose the model you want to use. And you can take the risks, take on the debt, hope that you get through it okay, or you can accept the fact that you're going to be less profitable but more secure and run a different kind of business. And the choice you make with respect to how you structure your business, and this is really my main point, is what ultimately determines your pricing policy. Because if you've got high levels of fixed cost and you've got a lot of debt, you have to charge a lot of money or generate a lot of volume for your services. If you don't, then you've got a lot more flexibility about how you price your product or your service. Okay? So the pricing decision doesn't start with the question, what am I going to charge? It starts way back with what kind of a business do I want to run? And then you structure the business you want to run, and then you price your product based on that cost structure, and based on how much volume you have to generate. It's really a lot more complicated issue than most people think about when they say, what should I charge? I'll have occasionally, when people are looking to start up a business, we'll have a client come into the office and say, when we ask about their competitive strategy, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deliver the best quality and the best service and charge the lowest price. And I'll usually say to them, then you'll be as busy as you want to be right up till the day you go broke. Because you can't do that. You simply can't do it. If you're going to deliver the best quality and service, you have to charge for it. If you're going to charge the lowest price in town, then you have to accept that there's a level of quality and service you can deliver, but you can't deliver any more than that. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as your customers understand that. Any questions on that? None?
No.
Okay. The next page in your handout is the one that will be of most interest to you, I think, because you basically run a service-oriented business as opposed to a product-oriented business. And that's how do you come up with a pricing policy when you sell a service? Basically, when you sell a service, you sell your time. That's all you have to sell. Plumbers, electricians, HVAC people. And so what you need to start with is a calculation of how much time you're actually selling. What I've constructed here is a little example, and you can follow along with it, that makes certain assumptions. That you work 52 weeks a year, that you work 5 days a week. Obviously, if you work more, you've got more hours available to sell. That you have 30 days leave time available for your people. By leave time, I mean paid holidays, sick time, and vacation time. I've just arbitrarily said that adds up to 30 days. It probably does. It comes pretty close to that. And most importantly, that 20% of the hours that you work every day, and I'm going to use an 8-hour day here, are non-billable. One of the things that we run into constantly with people who think they're charging enough is the fact that they don't realize that they're only billing about 5 hours a day. There's lunch, there's coffee breaks, but more importantly, and this is the real killer, in the remodeling business, for example, you're running to the shop for something, you're running to the yard for something, you're returning stock, you're picking up stock, you're swapping stock, and all of that time people don't charge for. You're also out hustling up new business, so you're quoting business. There's hours out of the day. You're coming back for another visit. There's hours out of the day. And when you point out to people, I've actually asked people to keep a timesheet when we score clients and say, look, do me a favor for a month. Just keep track of how much time you don't work during the day, that you're not physically on the job working. And they're astonished at how many hours it adds up to. And they'll say, gee, I'm charging enough. I said, no, you're not, because you're not working enough hours. You're not working for $65 an hour. You're working for $40 an hour because of all of the time you're putting in that you can't bill for. So that's what the purpose of this calculation is. You look at my little example here, and I've given you a cost profile for this business. 4 employees at $36,000 each. That's salary plus benefits. Overhead, that's the operating expenses of the business. And then the owner has put in this calculation, $50,000 for himself. I'm assuming the owner is not actively working on the job. Okay? So I'm not counting the owner's hours in this. So there's $235,000 that has to be recovered. And if you go through this calculation of the annual hours available for a 4-man workforce, there are 5,888 hours available to recover that $235,000. It's simple arithmetic. What do I have to charge for each one of those 5,888 hours to come up with $235,000? And the answer is $40. And there's your pricing model. You want to make more money? How much more do you want to make? Another $10,000? Change the 50 to 60, do the calculation over again. What this also allows you to play with, again, it's a financial model just like the previous break-even analysis was, that allows you to play the what-if game. One of my guys gets sick all of a sudden. One of my 4 employees is out for 2 weeks. I've got to pay him. My agreement is that he gets paid while he's out sick, so I'm still paying him. My cost structure hasn't changed, but my 5,888 hours just became something less. What do I do about that? Well, there are only a couple of answers. I either take less salary or I raise my prices. Okay? Well, I'm in a new competitive environment. $40 an hour, which is what I used to get, I can't get anymore. I can only get $30, $35 an hour. What's that do to my business? You can calculate it. If you don't do anything, if you keep 4 people on, then your $50,000 isn't going to be $50,000 anymore. Or you can get rid of somebody. Suppose I get rid of a person and drop down to $30, and I cut my overhead to $30. What does that mean for my business? What's my year look like? You can play with all sorts of scenarios before they happen. Anticipate them and decide what your strategy is once you have a model like this. Okay? Did I go through that too fast?
No.
Okay.
Or you can hire a Brazilian firm to the table and take the chances that you don't get sued or something.
What's that?
I was being sarcastic.
Oh, that's okay. Sarcasm is
I
good.
was thinking about the hiring of the people for
Oh.
half the price under the table and hope that you don't get sued or something. You know, which is what happens.
We
a
at
lot
S.C.O.R.E don't
on-
recommend that.
Of course you don't recommend it, and I don't recommend it, but that comes into play a lot with my competition.
One of the more frustrating counseling sessions I had a couple of years ago, the guy who had been in the business, he was primarily a roofer, did some framing, but he was primarily a roofer. And he'd been in business for about 10 years, and he built himself a nice little business. And he came in and he said, I'm running into a problem with these non-union organizations that are paying their people under the table. And I'm quoting jobs at 60 and 70,000, and they're quoting jobs at 30,000. And the people who contract with them know that they're not getting the quality of work that I can deliver. And what they do is they hire me at 10,000 and come back and fix some of the things that went wrong. They're still 20 grand ahead of the game. And he said, what do I do about that? What sort of strategy can I use to address that? I can't cut my prices and run the business the way I've been running it. I don't want to run it any differently than I've been running it, but I can't compete. I'm losing too much work. What should I do? And I said, I have to tell you. I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know it's a solvable problem. One of the things you can try to do is go after the high end of the market, where price is not so much of an issue and quality and service matter more. And so reorient yourself from the volume end of the business to the high end of the business if you can. And maybe you can cope with it that way, but I just don't know. You know, once in a while you run into problems where you have to say that, and this is one of those cases. So I know what you're talking about. Okay, finally, next to last page is a cash flow projection that I wanted to spend a few minutes on. When we talked about financial statements previously, we talked about them in a historical sense. That is, those financial statements told you what had happened. This financial statement is designed to tell you what you think is going to happen. So it's a projection. It's not a statement. Cash flow projections are designed to answer 4 questions. How much do you need? When are you going to need it? What are you going to need it for? And when can you pay it back? I designed this for a remodeling business. Months 1 through 6 are designed to be months January through June, so there's some seasonality in here. And this is something that if you've been in business a while, you should have been sitting down and doing in, say October of last year, in preparation for the first 6 months of this year. And if I could just quickly walk across the numbers, the cash receipts line shows the effect of seasonality. It starts out at $50,000 a month. And it's probably based on past history. If you've been in business a while, you know what your operating history is. Unless you've substantially changed the way you're doing business, or unless the economy has substantially changed, and obviously it has right now, then you base this projection pretty much on the basis of what's happened to you in the past during this period of time. So $50,000, $55,000, $60,000 a month. total of 410 over the 6-month period. The material costs are just the costs of buying the materials that go onto these remodeling jobs. This particular company uses a combination of their own employees and subcontractors. They've got a base payroll of 14,000, those are the direct employees, and then they supplement them with subcontractors as they get busier, and that's why that number keeps going up. And if you add all of those costs up and subtract them from the receipts, you've got that net cash line, which is positive at that level. You can see that, 9, 11, 11, and so forth. Operating costs, that's the cost of running the business, $18,000 a month, and that's fixed. In this example, I'm assuming that they don't make any substantial inventory purchases and that they don't buy any new equipment. So the fixed asset and inventory lines are left blank. But when you subtract the operating costs, you can see that at least for the first 4 months, you're in deficit. 9,000 in January, 7,000 in February, 7,000 in March, and so forth. And then it turns the corner as your volume picks up. Not an unusual situation on Cape Cod for businesses that are of a seasonal nature. And then the last line is the cumulative cash balance. Typical situation that's financed with a line of credit. Have any of you used lines of credit? So you know what I'm talking about. And if you do this in October or November, and if you've got a decent credit history, and you take this down to the bank and you say, look, I'd like to talk to you about a line of credit. I don't need anything now, but I'm going to need $25,000. That's how much I need. When are you going to need it? I anticipate needing $9,000 in January, $7,000 in February, and so forth and so on. What do you need it for? In this case, it's working capital. I need it to run the business during the slow period. When can you pay it back? I can start to pay it back in May. I can pay most of it back by the end of June, and if I extended this out another month, no doubt the loan would be paid off in July. Will you get the loan? In a heartbeat. Bankers love this stuff. What they don't love is somebody who didn't do this in October, who gets into the 3rd week in January and says, oh my God, I can't make payroll. I need a loan. And runs down to the bank and says, I've run out of cash, but I can pay you back. The banks don't like that. Come back to the comment I made earlier about the bank buying 2 things when they lend you money, your plan and you. This is one place where if you do this, you get your loan, and if you do the situation I just described, you probably don't, because you have not demonstrated the ability that a banker likes to see in anybody that they lend money to. So do this all the time. And we work with people at S.C.O.R.E. This stuff, particularly doing cash flow projections, for people who are not familiar with accounting, can be a difficult exercise. And that's one of the things we do a lot of at S.C.O.R.E. So if you think you want to do this, but you want help doing it, then call, make an appointment, set it up. Tell the, by the way, if you make an appointment, tell the secretary specifically that that's what you want to come in and talk about, so that she matches you up with an accounting and finance person as opposed to an e-commerce person or a marketing person. Okay? And then finally, on this last page, just to summarize, speaks for itself. Maintain good financial records. Use the information to run your business better. Think about how your business is organized and decide if that's the business model that works best for you, and if not, change it to the extent that you can. Calculate your break-even point. Create a little financial model of your business. Again, we can do that for you if you just bring in some basic financial stuff. Prepare cash flow projections and forecast your cash needs, and get in touch with us if you think we can be helpful. I picked up the pace on that a little bit, but I'm getting a little nervous as I look out the window. I hope it wasn't too fast for you.
No.
Very helpful.
Half hour
And that's it.
in no time.